reason why I chose the Raging Bitch beer is because I assume a lot of especially Harvard's president has called Trump a raging bitch multiple times behind closed doors. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross, and I'm very excited today because I have Seth Masket with me, who's a professor of political science at University of Denver and a phenomenal Substack writer, has a great Substack called Tusk, and currently finishing up a sabbatical at Vanderbilt. So Seth, the man of many things, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Very excited to have you. And we're going to be talking all about the attacks on higher education. And it's going to be an interesting one, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So before we dive in, what are we drinking?
So, since I am based in Nashville this year, I decided to drink a Black Abbey Pub Ale, which is brewed right here in Nashville, Tennessee. It's a nice dark ale. It's not too heavy. It's good for the hot weather that is starting to creep in here.
Yeah. Oh my God. I know. I've been bitching and moaning about how it's been so cold recently, and then it got hot, and I'm like, no, never mind. I changed my mind.
It turned quick. Yeah.
Okay. And I am drinking I think Flying Dog IPA. It's called Raging Bitch.
Ooh.
It felt right. And because I'm only halfway an adult, I don't know where my actual bottle opener went. So I'm currently using a can opener.
I mean, if you're not using your teeth, that's good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Ooh, good.
All right.
It tastes much less bitchy than I anticipated. It's actually quite nice.
Give it time.
Right. So, Seth, the question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Well, I don't know that you should, but what I would say is that I have been doing this whole political science thing. I've been at the University of Denver for 21 years. I was at UCLA for grad school for another 7 years before that. So, I've been at this in one form for another for at least a quarter century. And I've written a bunch of books on political parties, on party reform. My last book was on the Democratic Party. My current book is on the Republican Party. So, and I write just a lot. I've got a lot of stuff out there that is on pretty current affairs, changes to our party system, changes to our government. And I've just been writing a fair amount on on the attacks on higher ed. And I worked in higher ed, so a long time now, and I have some sense of what's going on there.
Yeah, you totally do. Yeah. And you're also a great follow on Blue Sky. So
thank you.
Yeah, highly recommend all around. And so we're going to dive into this kind of like the second portion of the podcast. But reason why I wanted you to come on is because you wrote a great Substack article kind of explaining the historical comparisons to what we're seeing now as we saw in the 1950s with the Red Scare. So excited to kind of dive into that. But before we do, let's set the scene. Donald Trump and his administration has been just clamoring down the doors of higher education, claiming that it is the breeding ground for woke liberal ideologies, and it's ruining this country. The reason why I chose the Raging Bitch beer is because I assume a lot of especially Harvard's president has called Trump a raging bitch multiple times behind closed doors. But why don't you kind of provide a little bit more insight into what's actually been going on and the effects of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know where to start. In some ways, this goes back a really long ways. There's been this sort of, longstanding conservative populist tradition in this country that goes back at least a century, that has often decided that higher education is the enemy. And it's a rhetorical device. It's a way of ginning up some anger among working class voters. They rarely follow through with any of it. But, there's just longstanding stereotypes of, intellectuals as they're amoral, they're barbarians, they turn us away from God, they turn us away from honesty and common sense. They're sneering at rural people. And you can occasionally see populist leaders come up with stuff like this. We heard a little bit of this with Ronald Reagan. We heard a little bit of this. You can go back to Wendell Willkie speeches in the 40s. And Trump has certainly played with that. It's interesting, though. If you look at Donald Trump's first term, he usually didn't go along with that. There were obviously a lot of people in his administration, a lot of prominent Republicans who were happy to just crap all over colleges and universities and complain that they're too woke, that they're too obnoxious, they're too snobby. Trump in his first term generally didn't play along with that. He liked to, if there was someone he liked, he would praise them for their elite education. He would brag about his own University of Pennsylvania education. He would brag about relatives of his who had Ivy League educations. Second term has been very different. He has decided to actually follow through on this thing that was kind of just a rhetorical device for the longest time, and actually try and change universities, try and shut them down, try and put professors out of work. So, this has taken on a lot of different dimensions. I think probably the most aggressive one was with Columbia University. Columbia was a great target for Trump to go after because after last year's protests about Israel and Gaza, they managed to alienate pretty much everyone.
They were like, we have no allies anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they were either too aggressive or not aggressive enough in dealing with protesters. They made everyone mad. And so they were an easy target. And Trump basically went after them, accusing them of anti-Semitism, which is a stretch. And then basically saying, we're going to take away your federal funding. We're going to, all the funding you get from the National Science Foundation, from the National Institutes of Health, from all sorts of federal grants that basically keep our research universities running. He just sort of jumped in and said, you're not getting that anymore. Now, it's not clear whether he can legally do that. I think he probably can't, but that hasn't really stopped him.
Well,
right?
Isn't that the question of every action of the Trump admin?
Yeah. He just basically say shut them down unless you agree to change the way you do hiring, change the way you teach classes, change the way you do admissions. And Columbia actually tried to capitulate somewhat. They tried to come up with some sort of agreement where they said, okay, we'll accept that the federal government has some oversight in some of our departments. We'll accept some changes to keep our federal research dollars coming. And they got what happens to most people who capitulate. They lost a lot of what they stand for, and they didn't get the money. Trump has continued to say, okay, well, you got to do more for me before you get any research money.
Yeah, today they even threatened their accreditation. Which also, but I was reading a little bit about, it's they don't really have the power to do anything about it, but it's still just a threat.
Yeah, the White House is not in the accreditation loop. I mean, that is just not a thing. But but he'll, it's one of those things where he doesn't have this power, but if everyone pretends he has that power, he kind of does.
Yeah, he's throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we had Columbia, who's, once again, hated on all ends. And it's really interesting because they're using this concept of anti-Semitism as kind of the way to justify in very strong air quotes, these attacks on higher education. As a Jewish person, it's bullshit, right? Okay, just getting that out of there.
As a Jewish person, I concur with that assessment. But yes.
Wonderful. We're all on the same page. But so Columbia happened. Columbia tried to acquiesce. Didn't go well. And then went after Harvard. And also, I'll say, ironically, it appears that Penn, which is Trump's alma mater, and also Yale, which is J.D. Vance's alma mater, have remained relatively unscathed. Perchance? Yes. I don't know. Coincidence? Who knows? So, but then they went after Harvard. And President has said, no, we're not going to acquiesce, and we're actually going to fight you in court. What I actually find interesting is one of the Harvard's lawyers is actually Robert Hirsch, who led the inquisition into Biden about the documents. Anyways, very interesting confluence of events.
Yeah.
But let's talk about Harvard and what's been going on since Harvard has fought back against the Trump admin.
Yeah, and that has been fascinating to watch. They basically decided to do the opposite of Columbia. They decided to push back, to not agree to any of these terms, and said we would rather go a little bit without some federal research dollars in order to preserve what we care about, to maintain our identity as essentially one of the world's leading research universities. That has been costly for them so far. Trump is really, and the Department of Education is really trying to put the screws to them. threatening to take away their tax-exempt status, to mess with their accreditation, to deprive them of millions of dollars in research funding. So that is ongoing. Now, one of the weird things is that like it's massively improved Harvard's public approval ratings. Like suddenly people are loving Harvard, which is, it took Donald Trump to do that. And also apparently from what I heard, like when they started very publicly resisting this, donations to Harvard started ramping up. Like there were a lot of small donors there. And that's like, again, not a thing I would necessarily recommend people do. It's a very wealthy school, but it was a sign of support. And so they have essentially become the face of the resistance in academia. Along those lines, there's been essentially like, sort of a growing like a league or an alliance of Big Ten schools that are trying to essentially form like a mutual defense pact. And, if one of them is attacked, they're all attacked. They'll all agree to like pool their resources to file lawsuits.
It's like NATO.
Exactly. It's totally what it is. And, they're just, we haven't really seen a test of it yet. And I don't think that much of it is actually written in ink. But there's just sort of a growing sense that colleges and universities can't really do this on their own. Very few of them have remotely the money that Harvard has. But acting collectively, yes, they can pool resources. They can help out each other's students. They can join for, they can share legal representation. There's a lot of things they can do in that regard.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What I find very interesting is the tie into immigration that this has managed to take on. The Trump admin has threatened, and I think done recently, to take away the visa process for students for Harvard and for a lot of others, and especially revoking, I think, almost all of it for Chinese students as well, which I think is around 300,000 students every year. I didn't really realize how that effect that would have, and that was my own ignorance of not connecting the two dots, But it seems like they're trying to smoke out these institutions financially, so they're just forced to acquiesce. What impact does getting rid of the international students have on higher ed?
I mean, there's so many layers to that. For one thing, like America's higher education institutions, it's literally, one of our best and most successful exports. In the sense that, if you look at like the top 10 or top 20 universities in the world, like of the top 20, probably like 17 or 18 are in the United States. This is widely regarded to be a real advantage that the U.S. has. And people all around the world want to send their children here to go to college. And some of those students come here, they stay around after graduation, they work in the U.S. Some of them go home and sort of spread this very pro-U.S. message. Like it has been a real example of the kind of soft power that a country has, and that this is just an advantage we have had over essentially every country in the world for a very long time. And suddenly that is being massively undermined. Suddenly, students can't come here, essentially, or they're worried that they're going to be sent home in the middle of the year, which is what happened to a number of students recently. And they'll have trouble finishing their degrees. So enrollments are massively going down among international students. So there's multiple dimensions to that. A lot of international students are graduate students. They're in our master's programs, they're in our doctoral programs. But there's certainly some who come as undergraduates, and for the most part, they pay full fare. They don't come at a reduced rate. So it's kind of like, it's expensive. Colleges are very expensive. And like one of the dirty secrets is that, part of the ways colleges like pay their bills is that they have a certain number of international students who come in paying all this money. So that also, if they can't come in, that actually puts the screws more on universities. But also it deprives a lot of people of a really good education. These graduate students are like big parts of the university system. A lot of them are doing really cutting edge research here. And a lot of them would stick around and either work in academia or work for, various medical corporations or scientific research companies or other areas that produce a lot of good things in the U.S., that produce a lot of scientific discoveries, win Nobel Prizes, all sorts of things. these folks are being either driven out or pushed out. And it's, it's hurting the bottom line. It's hurting the quality of higher education, and it's hurting really the U.S.'s standing in the world. And even if Trump stopped this today, or even if like the next president decided, well, that was a mistake, we're going to, refund everything and allow international students back in, a lot of the stuff you can't really start up on a dime. A lot of academic research takes years to put together. And you gotta hire support staff for it, and you gotta apply for funding, and it just is not an easy thing to restart. We're seeing some damage here that's going to last a very long time.
Wow, scary.
Yeah.
And also, you've seen the arrests, right, of some of these Columbia grad students and of these tough students who voice support for the Palestinian cause, and they've been detained, and they've continued to be detained. And it's scary and it's terrifying. You see a lot of people self-deporting as well, and it's just a complete disregard for freedom of speech anyway.
Yeah, it's a massive threat to freedom of speech. And it's essentially saying, okay, only some people get freedom of speech. We don't actually believe in these human rights. But it's also, it doesn't take that many arrests for people to notice, and for people around the world to say, I'm not going to even try this. I don't want to send my student there to get arrested. And so, it's just it's pre-deportation, essentially. People are not going to come here. And I would not blame them for that, too. For what it's worth, I've been to a number of academic conferences in the last few months that have had notably lower attendance because, in large part because a lot of scholars from other countries are fearful of coming here. They're fearful of being harassed, of being detained. And that, as far as I know, that trend is increasing, and it's getting harder and harder to fill up academic conferences and for people to come here.
And I mean, and also just big picture, it has such a detriment on the research and the advances for everything,
Totally. And other places around the world are picking up on this. China has suddenly devoted a lot of resources to trying to hire away productive American scholars. And they're doing it. They're successful at it. This is a great time to be trying to recruit American academics. A number of European countries are doing this too. They're setting aside funds to try and bring in productive scholars. And that's a very smart thing to do. And for the scholars who are recruited, that is probably a good opportunity to continue to do the research they care about in a safer environment. But it also means a massive brain drain from the U.S. It means the scholars who remain here, are going to be not the top producers, not the top people publishing. And everyone who can get out will. And, that is just not a healthy situation. And it's a massive reversal of something that's been really a key asset for this country for a long time.
Yeah, it's so dumb.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's very, very dumb, and it's very scary, and we saw a little bit of pushback, I guess, on the campaign trail with Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, advocating for international visas as well, because they recognize that as much as America wants to be, we're not always the best and brightest. That's just the reality of it.
Yeah, and that's a big part of high tech industries is bringing in well-trained people from other countries, and it's a very big part of the success of their companies, and they're losing that ability. And it's hard to know what argument would convince Trump that this is a mistake. I don't know that there is one. But if you tell him it's hurting our universities, he's like, well, I don't care. They're woke anyway. Tell them they're hurting businesses. You're like, well, yeah, but the good businesses will be fine. I mean, but it's a very chilling environment. It's actually, at least to some extent, splitting the Republican coalition.
Yeah, we're starting to see that a little bit more. And I'm like, keep going, please. But no, we had Kenneth Roth on the podcast, who is a former executive director of Human Rights Watch. And he talked all about the way that you challenge authoritarian powers is by shame. And so it's trying to find the shame for Donald Trump, right? And it's attacking his ego, So I can't do it half a beer in, but doing some brainstorming about how to attack his ego in regards to higher education.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
very interesting, like enlightening perspective, right? But definitely think a lot of it's going to come down to we're going to be falling behind Russia and behind China, behind
hmm
India in our intellect and our advancements and our technological advancements as well. And that brings me kind of into our next topic,
Okay.
which is the Red Scare.
Mm.
And this is not something that is necessarily new. Why don't you kind of dive into a little bit of the history surrounding the attacks on higher education in the past of American history?
Yeah. I mean, the Red Scare, you bring that up. This is mostly a phenomenon of the early 1950s, to some extent the late 1940s, when there was a bit of a panic about, not just the growing strength of the Soviet Union, but also this idea of that Soviets were infiltrating American society, that there were spies everywhere, that there were people trying to teach communism, teach socialism to American students, and it was going to weaken us from within. That was a big ideological concern at that period. And this is something that Senator Joseph McCarthy made a big deal on. A senator from Wisconsin, really like built his reputation on demonizing the secret communists in our society, and talking about the threats that were everywhere. That was not all centered on universities, but that was a big part of it. Concerns that there were socialists, there were hidden communists in a lot of universities. And honestly, there are some, right? There like when you actually look at like a sociology department or a political science department at a large university, yeah, you might find some socialists there. That's not against the law. But it was easy to demonize these people. They made an effort to really like go undercover and try and find that these people had ties to communist parties, that they advocated for the Soviet Union, and essentially like portray these people as like this fifth column working to undermine democracy and undermine the United States. So a lot of that came out in hearings in the U.S. Congress. It became sort of like an ongoing concern in mainstream journalism. And a number of universities at the time kind of went along with this. Like they were trying to root people out. The concept of tenure already existed at a lot of universities at that point. But it turned out that a big exception to tenure is you're a member of the Communist Party. So they can't fire you except, communists don't get tenure, something like that. So yeah, universities were willing to go along with some of that purge at the time. And by the end of that era, by the late 1950s, that was seen as a huge mistake. There's a wonderful book by a historian, Richard Hofstadter, his book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, which came out in the early 1960s. He really details what went on in that era. And like a big part of what reversed the tide on that was Sputnik. When the Soviets launched the first satellite in 1957, suddenly American leaders panicked that the Soviets were beating us in the space race. They were ahead of us scientifically. And suddenly, like, anti-intellectualism kind of died down, and there became, the governments just became obsessed with, like, we need to build up our universities. We need to hire a lot of people. We need to massively fund research. And suddenly the federal government got involved in providing research dollars for research universities. So, and that was like, in the 1960s, like, it's suddenly very fashionable to be at a university. And, the presidents and members of Congress would like highlight the contributions of these people, create medals for these people. We've only sort of seen this, what we're seeing now is sort of an echo of that period in the 1950s, but probably more aggressive. In the sense that, there's far more international students here, and they are really being attacked now.
Right. How did, you talk about Sputnik, right? Do you think there is going to be something like that? What do you think is going to kind of get the U.S. out of this anti-intellectual mindset that we're in? anti-higher ed education, but it's so fucking dumb because people equate anti-higher education with anti-intellectual. And I'm like, do you guys know what the word intellectual means?
That is the thing. Like, there is a significant chunk of this country that thinks intellectuals are bad, that they're a threat to American values, that they're a threat to Christianity. And it's hard to, in that sort of environment, it's hard to convince folks, no, this is actually good for you. We have seen situations in the past when you've had sort of scientific leaders in the world kind of demolish their own university system. I mean, that sort of describes the U.S. in the early 1950s. It describes Germany under the Third Reich. Germany in the early 20th century was by far the scientific leader in the world. They had the best scientists in physics and chemistry and a lot of fields. And Hitler coming to power just smashed that, drove out all the Jews, or killed them, who were, active in academia. A lot of others fled the country. After the war, the U.S. recruited a number of their scientists. The Soviets recruited a number of their scientists. It took a very long time for German universities to be functional again. And it's hard to know what would do it in this environment. Obviously, there is a big anti-intellectual vibe going on right now in the White House. It's not just about academia. They're going after vaccines. They're loosening restrictions on artificial intelligence. Like, there's a lot of massive crises that could occur in the near future. I don't know which one is going to happen. I don't know how many of them are just paranoia, but like an acknowledged pandemic, or a lot of people suddenly being put out of work, or, China leaping ahead of the US in defense technologies. Those are kind of things that could suddenly make a difference, and cause US leaders to wake up and say, hey, you know what, maybe we went too far in that. Let's pivot back in the other direction. But whatever it would be, it would have to be pretty dramatic at this point.
Yeah. Why do you think we've equated, or a lot of people, especially in the Conservative Party and rural members, have equated being educated as a negative?
I mean, I'm hesitant to ascribe that to like...
Yeah, I don't want to make that generalization, but...
Yeah. But I'm also hesitant to say like it's because of actual experience, or it's because, well, maybe professors were too snobby. Like, I don't think that actually is the thing. But part of the suspicion about it is that, first of all, college is expensive. Poor people do have a harder time affording it. Like, there's programs out there to make it easier. There's a lot of schools that offer aid, but it's still difficult, and it seems out of reach. And there are a lot of folks, and particularly in, I'm hyper generalizing here, but particularly in like poor rural areas in this country, when their kids are able to go away to college, they might come back speaking differently. They've been exposed to different values. They've been exposed to different sorts of people that they knew growing up, and they might behave differently. And that can scare parents, or they might just not come back at all. They prefer to stay in a city and get a job there. And that can make people angry. They might blame universities for exposing their kids to things they shouldn't have been exposed to. And they're very easily susceptible to arguments that, colleges are just warping your kids. They're turning them against you. And so, I mean, that has... I don't know that there's some ring of truth to that, but I think it certainly makes people vulnerable. Also just the fact that, like, if you make these arguments enough, if enough politicians are arguing this, if you see enough of this on Fox News and other conservative media, that academic research is wasteful, that academics are sneering at you, it's hard not to believe some of that at some point.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just constant hounding and hounding and hounding.
Yeah.
And really, this is what always gets me so upset, is when people on the left criticize the intelligence of people on the right.
Yeah.
I don't think that's correct. I don't think it's right. And I think it's honestly detrimental to the greater good of society. And I also think it's also extremely detrimental to Democrats that want to get back into power, right? Because if you criticize and you undermine the Republican Party and their actions, whatnot, and the absolute brilliance that they have done in undermining media, right? and so people don't believe truth when they should see truth, then you're just always 4 steps behind,
Yeah.
and you're not able to have that actual conversation, actually able to bring yourself to the table, And so it's just such an interesting dichotomy and dynamic that's been established. And, when they were talking about going after, by they, I mean the Trump admin, going after these higher education institutions, talking about giving some of the money to trade schools. I'm like, that's incredible. Give money to trade schools. Don't sacrifice the higher ed, but give money to trade schools. Like, I do think part of this element, as you said, is the fact that as a society, we valued higher education so much more over traditional trades, but both are equally important, And so I do also think that a lot of higher ed institutions need to recognize the fact that there is this lack of kind of inclusion of people that from lower incomes and for people from rural areas because and also equating their education and equating their life experience is just as valuable as a higher education.
Yeah. And I agree with that. And I would add that in some ways, higher ed is fairly easy to mock or to demonize because if you start digging through individual papers, dissertations, research grants, you can always find something that sounds silly or you can find something that sounds wasteful. I mean, a few years ago, there was a lot of fuss being made about a grant to, putting, I think, brine shrimp on a treadmill or something like that. And, said, look at what we're wasting money on. Look at what these eggheads are doing. And it turned out it was some sort of study about how to improve the lives and mobility of shrimp for shrimp farming, essentially. It was about improving the food supply. But you don't get that from the caricatures. I would also say that, and it's sort of self-reflective thing. Higher ed is not always great at advocating for itself. There has been, often the real defense of higher education is that it prepares students for the workforce. It's seen as this sort of place where they can get a degree, they can get some basic business training, and then go work in a business somewhere. And that's fine to some extent. That's not remotely all that colleges do. And particularly there's a lot of liberal arts schools out there, including University of Denver, where I teach, where in many ways the goal is, it's this really kind of old, long-standing liberal goal, old school liberal, that colleges can improve people's minds. It can improve people's lives. And that actually making them better thinkers, making them, exposing them to a wide variety of thought and learning styles and challenging their beliefs makes for better people. Who can actually use those things to solve other problems later in their life. And that's an important skill. It is also, and that's still being taught out there, but it's not something that gets nearly the attention it deserves and is not very clearly articulated by a lot of our schools.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I went to WashU in St. Louis, which I think was, I don't know if it still is, but the time I was there had the highest average family income. Right. So, and, I think it was $70,000 a year to attend college, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And it's nuts. And there is not one hard skill that I really learned in college that I use in my day job. Not too much, right? I do a lot of video editing. I do a lot of voiceover work. I do a lot of, podcasting and taught myself how to edit, right? Didn't learn any of that in college.
Right.
What I did learn was the ability to open my mind, was the ability to pursue things I'm interested in, the ability to have conversations, and the ability to become an adult. Those 4 years are so fundamental and important to nurture that I think just the assumption that college is going to get you a good job, and especially what everyone has seen nowadays, which that's not necessarily true, right? There does need to feel like there needs to be this kind of reconciliation with, fact. And then I feel maybe it would be a lot harder for the Conservative Party to shit on higher ed in the way that it does.
I would hope. What a great example of this. my former provost, I want to give a shout out to him, Greg Kvistad. He's retired now, but he once made this point that like people ask what a provost actually does, and he was like, it's mostly spreadsheets. Like he's dealing with budgets, he's dealing with requests, and he has to decide. He just has to make decisions about where to allocate money. And he says, so that sounds like a very basic skill, but while he's doing it, he has all these German philosophers in his head arguing about what fairness means. And so he's trying to think about equitable ways to divide the dollar and what actually is fair, what's appropriate. And he's like, that was the real value of education there, not learning how to use a spreadsheet, not learning how to, plan a budget or anything like that, but deciding what fairness is. And that's not, that's harder to teach. And that's hard. That's something that's harder to pick up in the workforce. Whereas like, yeah, you can pick up Adobe Editor or something like that in the workforce. You don't necessarily need to learn that in a school. And if you do learn that in school, 5-10 years later, the technology is totally outmoded anyway. But actually like learning how to think, learning how to reason, that's really important. And it can't just be done overnight.
Totally agree. Education is good. It should be good. It's cool. I like to learn. You like to teach. You like to learn, Like it's a shame that we've demonized learning in a way it's honestly, it's all part of the playbook, right? And it's a brilliant way for them to do it because nothing unites people more than a common hatred, right? But this education and higher ed is not the enemy. It's just they're just trying to make people dumber and trying to scare people. And that only people that benefits are those who are in power, in my personal opinion.
Yeah. I mean, you can see it in like when there's opinion polls around the world about, how people feel about the U.S. Like even when the U.S. is like throwing its military weight around and, messing with everyone's economy and everything like that, there's still a fair amount of goodwill out there, in large part because of the higher ed system. Because people value that, and they'll study here for a while and they'll come away feeling good about the country and feeling good about its legacy. And that's being squandered. It's really going away.
Yeah. It's just going to hurt everyone, especially with having difference of opinions is so important, and being able to experience everyone from different worlds and cultures is so important. And also all the research funding that's being decimated, right? That's just going to have incredible impacts on the immediate and on the macro levels of society. Seth,
yes.
Any last things you want to talk about?
One little lesson here. I've been talking with a lot of other academics about this, and like in terms of, there seems to be like different strategies that different schools are considering right now, and how to deal with this situation if they haven't been targeted yet. And some schools are clearly just trying to keep their head down, like a student who hasn't done the reading, and just hope they don't get called on. And that can work for a little while. But what we've really seen is that you don't get to choose whether you're targeted. You get to choose how you respond to that. And I think being proactive, being willing to work with other schools and push back in this moment, I think is vitally important for schools right now. And they can't just sort of hope the bad passes over, goes to someone else. Because there's a lot they can do together if they actually, decide to collaborate.
Yeah, there's power in numbers.
Yep.
Totally. Well, Seth, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Certainly. It's been a delight talking to you.
Good. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.